increased during COVID-19 lockdowns among a sample of Malaysian adults.
Apa ya guru muda, dosen muda itu belum berpengalaman.
Hi, my name is Chiang WI and I'm a PhD student from University Putra
Ya Allah,
Malaysia.
ibu pola
The
pahan.
topic of my presentation today is, has entry intake changed the cardiometabolic rates during COVID-19 lockdowns among a sample of Malaysian adults? My presentation will cover introduction, materials and methods, results and discussions, and conclusions. Metabolic syndrome is defined by the World Health Organization as a pathologic condition characterized by abdominal obesity, hypertension, dyslipidemia, type 2 diabetes, and insulin resistance. The worldwide prevalence of metabolic syndrome is 20 to 25% among the adult population. In Malaysia, the prevalence of metabolic syndrome is 34% among the adult population. A systematic review and meta-analysis of prospective observational studies reported that metabolic syndrome was associated with a twofold increase in the risk of cardiovascular disease and 1.5-fold increase in all-cause mortality. So what is cardiometabolic risk CMR? Cardiometabolic risk abnormalities consider high waist circumference, high triglyceride, low HDL cholesterol, high blood pressure, and high fasting glucose. The cutoff for waist circumference is population and country specific. In Malaysia, the cutoff is 90 cm and above in men, 80 cm and above in women. High triglyceride, the cutoff is 1.7 millimoles per liter and above, or on drug treatment for elevated triglyceride. For HDL cholesterol, the cutoff is less than 1 millimole per liter in men, less than 1.3 millimoles per liter in women, or on drug treatment for reduced HDL cholesterol. For blood pressure, the cutoff for systolic blood pressure is 130 and above, and diastolic blood pressure 85 and above, or on hypertensive medication. For fasting blood glucose, the cutoff is 5.6 millimole per liter and above, or on drug treatment for hyperglycemia. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the prevalence of obesity, dyslipidemia, and metabolic syndrome had increased significantly. In South Korea, the number of patients whose metabolic syndrome was worse had increased by 21%. Two studies conducted online survey to investigate the dietary intake of Italian adults. They found that the pandemic had changed the dietary intake of the Italian adult. So its change in dietary intake wasn't the metabolic syndrome. There is currently a lack of research in Malaysia regarding the dietary intake and CMR assessment during the pandemic. Malaysian government had imposed the lockdown during the COVID-19 pandemic, and so a physical research study was not possible. Due to the mass usage of social media, online survey could be an alternative approach to conduct studies, and therefore, we conducted a cross-sectional study among a sample of Malaysian adults to determine the dietary intake and CMR assessment during the lockdown by using an online survey. The primary objective of the study is to determine the prevalence of cardiometabolic risk among a sample of Malaysian adults during the pandemic of COVID-19. Secondary objective is to determine the associated risk factors of cardiometabolic risk, particularly the dietary intake among a sample of Malaysian adults. This is a web-based cross-sectional study conducted from 1st of November to 31st of December 2021 across the whole Malaysia with 13 states and 3 federal territories. The survey was shared through the online platform where the poster was shared through email, Facebook, and WhatsApp. Ethics approval was obtained from the Ethics Committee for Research Involving Human Subjects of UPM. The inclusion criteria of the study were Malaysian adults from the whole Malaysia aged between 18 to 60 years old and were Malay or English literate. Exclusion criteria was individuals who were pregnant or breastfeed. Self-reported height and weight was obtained from the respondent, and BMI was calculated based on that. Self-reported waist circumference was also obtained from them by providing the pen size and measurements in inches and centimeters. We also use Singapore Short Diet Screener to assess the dietary intake of the respondent. This screener consists of 37 items and has been validated in a multi-ethnic Singaporean population. This questionnaire was also comparable to Malaysian population since Singapore has similar ethnicity and dietary practices as Malaysia. We also used the Finnish Diabetes Risk Score to assess the CMR assessment. The Finnish Diabetes Risk Score was commonly used to screen type 2 diabetes and is a preferred questionnaire because it did not involve laboratory tests. And recently, this questionnaire has been validated and used to predict metabolic syndrome. This is because patients with glucose intolerance or type 2 diabetes, they are mostly present with metabolic syndrome since both involve a cluster of insulin resistant and disturbance of glucose metabolism. Data was analyzed using SPSS version 25. All statistical tests were set at a significant level of p-value less than 0.05. The distribution normality of continuous data was checked. Descriptive analysis was used to summarize the variables. For bivariate analysis, the associations of categorical variables and CMR were tested using the chi-square test of independence. About 60% of our respondents aged 18 to 29 and 40% aged 30 to 60. Majority of them were female and from central region of Malaysia. About 60% of them were Malay, 30% were Chinese, and 11% were Indian and other races. This proportion was similar to the actual breakdown of Malaysian population by ethnicity. About 70% of the respondents were single. About 50% of the respondents had low household income. Most of them had tertiary education. About 44% of them were overweight or obese, and about a quarter of them had waist circumference above the normal cutoff point. 39.6% of the respondents had CMR, and this was higher than the prevalence of metabolic syndrome of a previous local study, which has 34%. About 44% of the respondents were overweight or obese. In our study, BMI was significantly associated with CMR, and this finding was similar to the findings from previous study. He et al. Reported that the prevalence of metabolic syndrome increased by 10% with every 2-unit increase in BMI among Chinese adults with BMI above 23.9. A local study reported that Malaysian adults with metabolic syndrome had higher BMI compared to those without metabolic syndrome. Weight gain and obesity leads to insulin resistance, which inhibits the glucose uptake in peripheral tissues and stimulates lipolysis in adipose tissues, which then leads to excessive release of free fatty acids, causing dyslipidemia. Insulin resistance also causes pancreatic beta cells to secrete more insulin to maintain the blood sugar level. Failure to secrete sufficient insulin leads to hypoglycemia, thus glucose intolerance, and eventually type 2 diabetes. Insulin resistance also promotes the secretion of angiotensin II that enhances sympathetic nerve system nerve activity and increase the blood pressure. About a quarter of the respondents had waist circumference above the normal cutoff. In our study, waist circumference was significantly associated with CMR, and this was in line with findings from a 9-year cohort study where they reported that reducing waist circumference by 3 cm and above had beneficial effects on metabolic syndrome in women, even after accounting for changes in BMI. A 10-year cohort study conducted among normotensive non-diabetic Chinese adults showed that the baseline waist circumference and change in waist circumference predicted hypertension incidence. Studies show that even normal weight individuals with waist circumference above the cutoff point have metabolic abnormalities, including an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. Another study reported that reduced abdominal fat is associated with reduced risk of cardiovascular disease, including reduced systemic inflations and CMR. Our study shows that CMR was significantly associated with wholemeal noodles, pasta, and other vegetables. A series of systematic reviews and meta-analyses reported that a 15 to 30% reduction in all-cause and cardiovascular-related mortality and incidence of coronary heart disease, stroke, and type 2 diabetes when comparing the highest dietary fiber consumers with the lowest consumer. The findings of whole grain food are comparable to those for dietary fiber, suggesting the positive impact of whole grains could be due to their high fiber content. CMR was significantly associated with red meat in our study. A secondary analysis of a previous published RCT reported an increased risk of metabolic syndrome incidence among Spanish adults with highest total of red meat consumption compared to those with the lowest total. And this could be explained by red meat contains compounds such as cholesterol and saturated fatty acids that increase CMR. An 11-year longitudinal study that investigated the incidence of metabolic syndrome with different types of protein intake also found a positive association between incidence of metabolic syndrome with red meat. In our study, CMR was significantly associated with the amount of sugar added to coffee. Two systematic review and meta-analysis of RCT reported that dietary sugars influence body weight, blood pressure, and serum lipids. Excessive sugar intake affects the regulation of lipids and carbohydrate metabolism directly or indirectly by promoting positive energy balance, leading to weight gain and increased CMR. The strength of our study is the use of the online survey, which is the novelty of the study during the pandemic, provides new insights related to the dietary intake and CMR assessment. Another strength is the validated self-administered questionnaires were simple and friendly to the respondents. Limitations are the limited outreach on the online platform because we only reach subjects, respondents who have internet access and electronic gadgets, and this may lead to sampling bias. Also, the self-reported measurements might lead to measurement bias where the respondents might underreport or overreport their weight, height, waist circumference, and their dietary intake. Lastly, the 37 items short diet screener was a simplified diet questionnaire and might produce less accurate findings. In conclusion, the CMR in our study was 39.6%, which is higher than the previous data. About half of the respondents were overweight or obese. About a quarter of them had waist circumference above the normal cutoff, and CMR was significantly associated with BMI, waist circumference, wholemeal noodles, red meat, other vegetables, and the amount of sugars added in coffee. The COVID-19 lockdown had impacted the dietary intake and CMR of Malaysian adults. The Malaysian government and healthcare professionals should take this seriously since it attributes to the rising of non-communicable disease, and more nutritional educational program is warranted to educate the Malaysian population in modifying their dietary intake. And this is the references. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the wonderful talks, Ms. Chiang WI.
Yes. Good morning.
Yeah, good morning. Nice to meet you. And then we will continue to the discussion section. First, I will invite Dr. Tony.
Okay, morning.
Good morning.
I think it is very interesting research that have been done in your country. But I just want to know more about your, please read carefully with your abstract. Yeah? Your abstract mentioned that, can I say it? The CMR was investigated using the Finnish diabetes risk score. Yeah, that's right.
Yes.
But you don't mention the result and this discussion about the score. How much score that the HMR will increase. Yeah, you didn't mention about the score. Please
Yes.
check your conclusion. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, thank you for your question,
Yeah.
Dr. Tony. Yeah, actually, the presentation that I presented today is the secondary analysis of my study. So,
Okay.
we actually use the Findrich score to analyze the CMR among the sample. And we found that actually the 34% of our sample were actually at the risk of CMR using the Findrich score. Because at that time, laboratory test, the blood test was not possible due to the lockdown. So we actually found that 3 studies that actually validate this Findrich score test to predict the metabolic risk. So that was why we used this questionnaire to predict the CMR. But I'm sorry that because this was the secondary analysis, so we did not actually present it in our presentation today. Yeah.
So that's why I would like to know the COVID-19 lockdown. This is your policy from your government. It
Yeah.
is closely related with the higher CMR.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When we compared it to the risk before the lockdown,
Before the
our
lockdown.
result shows that it's higher. The previous percentage was 34, then ours was 39.6%. Yes.
Okay. That's mean the lifestyle of the population changes.
Yes.
That's right.
Yes, correct.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now we will go into the next review for the Dr. Betty. Hello.
Mr. Ahmad Soki.
Yes, please.
Okay, this is a nice presentation. Maybe in your method, how to determine how much sample size needed for 8 states in Malaysia and 3 federal territorial? Mrs. Chiang.
Can I repeat your question? Your question is how do I determine the sample size?
Yes, how do you calculate maybe
how much sample size needed for
the minimum sample size for your study?
No.
Yeah.
I mean, Mrs. Chiang, how to determine how much sample size needed for each state in Malaysia and 3 federal territorial?
So Dr. Betty, your question is how to determine the sample size for each state and territory, right? Yeah, okay, all right. Because we are using online questionnaire, and for our methods, we actually use convenient sampling method. So we did not actually determine, we did not stratify the sample size based on each states and all those, because it was not possible. We for the survey, we actually post it in Facebook. We circulate it through email to the students in university as well as the staff, and also through the words by mouth. So we just take whoever that completed the survey. So we did not actually determine how much sample size for each state, but for the sample size, we actually calculate it based on our objective. So, and also in view of the non-respondents, we actually increase the sample size by 30%.
Okay, is there any? Okay, thank you. Ms. Betty, do you have any question? Okay, I think enough. I would like to ask you some question first.
Yes.
I think this is the interesting study, and you have done by online, isn't it?
Yes.
How you measure the? I just saw that you have some data related to the anthropometric body mass index. How you measure it by online?
Yeah. We actually did not measure it ourselves, so we actually rely on the respondents to measure their weight or their usual weight. And for the waist circumference, if the respondents, they do have measuring tape, they can measure it, because in our survey, we do provide the inches, in the measurement in inches. But also, we also provide the pen sizes, just in case for those responders, they did not know their waist circumference and they do not have the measuring tape at home. Yeah.
Okay, I think it is interesting, right? How can you analyze the bias? Because I think is there all the respondents know how to measure it accurately?
Yeah. We do note the bias from there, but because this was done during the lockdown where physical contact was not possible, so we do take note in the limitations that actually there are bias from the respondents might underreport or overreport. Yeah.
Okay, so you just mentioned it in the limitation on your paper, right?
Yeah.
Okay, my last question.
Yeah.
You said that the prevalence obesity, dyslipid, and metabolic syndrome increased significantly during the pandemic in Malaysia. Yeah, and can you explain more why it can be like that?
Yeah. I think because the lockdown in Malaysia was quite a long time, and during that time, we were not allowed to go out to have our daily activities and all those, and we were forced to stay at home. And most of in terms of the diet, right, most of us, we had home cooked food. So that was one of the factors, and the other was because we were not allowed to go out. So outdoor activities like exercise and all those was not possible unless that we can exercise at home with all the equipments and all those. So for my point of view, because of the changes in the dietary habits, dietary intake, as well as the physical activity levels, so this leads to increase in most probably the weight of most Malaysian, and which then leads to increase of the CMR. Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. Very nice talk. And then
Thank you so much.
yeah, thank you for the explanation, and then good luck for the paper. Yeah, I think this is the good paper. You can submit it on good journal. Thank you, Miss
Dr. Saki.
Tian Wan Ling. Thank you so much. And then we will go